Hello, my dear friends. Tonight we do not enter a battlefield, and we do not ride across a windy plain. Instead, we walk slowly through stone corridors lit by candles, inside castles where power lived behind curtains, whispers, and closed doors. Medieval royalty did not live only in wars and ceremonies. Much of their history unfolded in private chambers, in letters, in rumors, and in the quiet talk of servants, who saw more than any official record ever admitted. In the Middle Ages, a queen was never simply a wife. She was a political bridge. Marriages were arranged to stop wars, secure borders, or connect rival dynasties. A princess could grow up in one kingdom and suddenly be sent hundreds of miles away to marry a man she had never met. She left behind language, family, and childhood all at once. When she arrived, she was expected to produce heirs, behave with dignity, and represent stability. But real life rarely followed perfect expectations, and the pressure placed upon queens created situations that often became scandal. The first thing to understand is that medieval courts were full of watching eyes. Servants, guards, nobles, priests. Hundreds of people lived inside a royal palace. Privacy barely existed. Even a queen's bedroom was rarely empty of attendants. Ladies-in-waiting slept nearby, dressed her in the morning, and remained present throughout the day. Because of this, gossip traveled faster than official news. A single unusual meeting or a late-night conversation could grow into a story repeated across the entire kingdom. Reputation mattered more than truth. A queen could become famous not for what she actually did, but for what people believed she might have done. Political enemies understood this very well. If a king wanted to weaken another ruler, spreading scandal about the queen could be more effective than raising an army. Accusations did not need proof. They only needed repetition. One of the most famous figures connected to such whispers was Isabella of France, Queen of England in the early 1300s. She married King Edward II when she was still very young. At first, she fulfilled her role properly, attending ceremonies and supporting the crown. But Edward gave unusual attention to certain male favorites at court, especially a nobleman named Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despencer. Nobles resented these men because they received lands and influence that others believed they deserved. Isabella's position became uncomfortable. She found herself isolated in a foreign court where powerful advisors surrounded her husband and ignored her concerns. Over time, she built alliances with nobles who also opposed Despencer. Eventually, she traveled to France and refused to return unless conditions changed. Instead, she gathered support, crossed back into England with allies, and helped remove her husband from power. The king was forced to abdicate, and her young son became Edward III. Immediately, rumors began. Chroniclers, writing years later, described her relationship with one of her supporters, Roger Mortimer, in ways meant to shock readers. Whether their connection was romantic or political remains debated by historians, but medieval writers turned the story into scandal. For them, a queen taking political action outside her expected role was easier to explain through gossip than through strategy. The label of immoral behavior followed her long after her actual decisions had reshaped English government. Another widely discussed queen was Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI of England during the Wars of the Roses. Henry struggled to rule effectively, and Margaret stepped into leadership during crises. She organized armies, negotiated alliances, and protected her son's claim to the throne. Yet opponents spread claims about her personal conduct. Pamphlets and poems accused her of inappropriate behavior and questioned the legitimacy of her child. Again, these accusations served politics. Undermining the queen meant undermining the heir. What becomes clear as we walk through these candlelit halls is that medieval scandal often reflected fear of female power. A queen who remained silent and obedient was praised. A queen who advised, negotiated, or commanded support was described in darker tones. Chroniclers, many of them monks, interpreted strong influence through moral suspicion because it fit the expectations of their time. Inside the palace, daily life continued. Meals were held in large halls, music played in evenings, and court rituals filled long hours. Yet beneath this normal appearance moved constant tension. Every conversation could be reported. Every visitor noticed. A queen learned to speak carefully, trust selectively, and manage her image constantly. Even kindness to a visiting noble might be repeated as secret affection by morning. Servants carried trays through corridors and heard fragments of conversation. Guards watched who entered and left private rooms. Letters traveled across borders and were sometimes opened before reaching their destination. In such an environment, rumor almost became inevitable. The more powerful the kingdom, the stronger the gossip surrounding its ruler's household. So as night deepens around the castle walls, we begin to understand that medieval queens lived not only under crowns, but under observation. Their reputations could rise or fall not from private actions, but from the stories others chose to tell. In the next part, we will continue through other courts of Europe, where new rulers, new alliances, and new accusations shaped how history remembered its queens, and how rumor often became stronger than fact. The castle sleeps lightly, but the court never truly rests. Even in the late hours, candles burn inside chambers where scribes copy letters and servants move quietly across stone floors. It is here, in these quieter spaces rather than the throne room, that reputation was often decided. A queen's image was shaped not during coronations but during ordinary evenings. Who she spoke to, who she trusted, and who watched her. To understand why stories about queens became so intense, we must remember how unusual their position was. A medieval king ruled openly. He rode in battles, gave public orders, and displayed authority in daylight. A queen ruled indirectly. She influenced through advice, conversation, and alliances. Because her power worked in private rather than public view, people tried to explain it. And when they could not see how influence happened, they imagined it must come from personal relationships rather than political skill. In France, one figure often surrounded by such talk was Isabeau of Bavaria, queen of King Charles VI during the late 1300s and early 1400s. Charles suffered periods of mental illness, sometimes unable to recognize even his own family. During those times, someone had to help manage royal decisions, and Isabeau remained present at court. She attended councils, approved documents, and negotiated between rival factions of nobles. The kingdom depended on stability, yet the situation was fragile. Because she appeared active in politics, enemies spread damaging rumors. Chronicles accused her of luxury, of favoritism, and of improper closeness to certain advisors. Modern historians often see these claims as exaggerated or invented, written by opponents during civil conflict between Burgundian and Armagnac factions. But at the time, Such accusations traveled quickly. The public saw a queen participating in governance and searched for explanation. Instead of crediting administrative necessity, many writers described scandal. Her reputation suffered even though the kingdom's instability had many deeper causes beyond her control. Court life itself encouraged speculation. Unlike modern leaders who travel with small staff, medieval royalty lived surrounded by hundreds. Banquets filled large halls. Guests arrived constantly from other territories. During celebrations, music and dancing lasted late into the night. In such an environment, familiarity between nobles could easily be misinterpreted by observers eager for dramatic stories. Letters also played a major role. Queens wrote often, to family abroad, to allies, to church leaders. Written words were political tools, yet intercepted correspondence could be twisted. A formal phrase of courtesy might later be repeated as evidence of affection. Once copied and retold, the original meaning faded. Rumor required only suggestion. We also meet Joan of Navarre, Queen of England and widow of a Breton duke, whose later years included accusations of witchcraft during the early 1400s. Though not scandal of romance, it reflected the same fear of influence. She maintained contacts and managed estates independently, unusual behavior for widowed royalty. During a time of suspicion, she was briefly arrested and accused of using supernatural means to harm the king. No proof was found, and she was eventually released. But the episode showed how quickly a powerful woman could be turned into a figure of unease when her authority felt difficult to explain. The important detail is that many of these stories appeared during moments of political stress. When kingdoms faced war, succession disputes, or financial crisis, blame searched for a visible target. A queen, living in the palace yet not leading armies directly, became an easy subject for speculation. Describing her influence as improper behavior simplified complex events into a personal drama the public could understand. Inside the castle walls, daily routine continued unchanged. Morning prayers were followed by audiences, meals, and the management of household finances. Queens supervised clothing production, arranged marriages of attendants, and oversaw charity to monasteries and the poor. Their responsibilities were constant. Yet chroniclers rarely wrote about these ordinary duties because routine did not attract attention. Instead, they recorded rumor, which readers remembered. So as the torches flicker along long corridors and footsteps echo in distant halls, we begin to see that medieval scandal often reveals more about society than about the queens themselves. The court expected queens to be visible but silent, important but passive. When reality required them to act, explanation turned into story, and story into legend. And as the night grows quieter, we continue walking deeper into other royal households, where another queen's life would show how power, expectation, and gossip could combine to shape a reputation lasting centuries beyond her lifetime. The candles burn lower in the corridor, and we continue our slow walk through another royal residence, this time moving toward the Iberian Peninsula, where courts were filled with ceremony, religion, and powerful noble families competing quietly for influence. Here we find one of the most talked about queens of late medieval Europe, Maria of Padilla, closely connected to King Peter of Castile in the 1300s. Her story shows very clearly how easily private relationships could turn into political legend. Peter became king while still young, ruling a land where noble families already held strong power. When he formed a close relationship with Maria, she became central to his personal life. Later, after Peter's death, supporters claimed that he had secretly married her, and that she was therefore his legitimate queen. Opponents rejected this claim and insisted she had only been his companion. The disagreement was not simply romantic curiosity, it affected inheritance and royal legitimacy. If she had been his lawful wife, her children could claim the throne. Because of this, chroniclers began writing very different descriptions of her character. Some portrayed her as gentle and devoted, while others described her as dangerously influential over the king. The truth is difficult to reconstruct, because each writer supported a different political side. Yet the existence of these opposing accounts reveals how reputation could be shaped by power struggles rather than by confirmed actions. Medieval society placed enormous importance on royal marriage. A queen's primary duty was to produce a clear heir recognized by all nobles. If uncertainty existed about that heir's status, conflict could follow. Therefore, stories about a queen's personal life became directly connected to national stability. What might appear a private matter today was, in that world, a political crisis. We also begin to see another reason rumors grew easily. Kings themselves often married for alliance rather than affection. A diplomatic marriage might connect two kingdoms, but not create emotional closeness. When a king showed visible attention towards someone outside that arrangement, observers interpreted it dramatically. Even ordinary companionship could be described as scandal, because it challenged expectations of royal duty. Inside these courts, daily life still followed ritual. Mass was attended regularly. Meals were served according to rank. Nobles waited hours for brief conversations with the monarch. Queens supervised embroidery workshops, arranged education for young attendants, and organized charitable giving. Yet the more structured the ceremony became, the more attention turned to moments outside ceremony. A private meeting, a late conversation, or an unplanned visit. Servants again played an important role. They carried messages between rooms, brought clothing, and overheard conversations unintentionally. Most remained loyal, but some shared details with patrons seeking advantage. A rumor that began as a small observation could reach powerful nobles by evening and travel across regions within days. Religious expectation intensified scrutiny. The church held great influence and emphasized moral conduct, especially for rulers whose behavior was believed to affect the entire kingdom's fortune. If harvests failed or wars went poorly, people sometimes searched for moral causes. A queen accused of improper behavior became a symbolic explanation for events otherwise difficult to understand. We should also remember that medieval writing itself encouraged dramatic storytelling. Chroniclers often wrote not only to record events, but to teach moral lessons. Presenting a queen as virtuous or immoral allowed writers to explain political change through clear narrative, rather than complicated economics or diplomacy. Over time, these writings shaped memory more strongly than daily reality. So in these stone halls where banners hang quietly and footsteps echo across polished floors, reputation continues to grow larger than fact. A queen might spend her day managing household accounts and meeting ambassadors, yet history remembers her through the stories repeated afterward. The combination of politics, expectation, and storytelling created images that lasted centuries. And as the night air cools outside the palace walls, we move forward to another court where the pressure of succession, family alliances, and constant observation would produce yet more tales, reminding us again how power and rumor walked side by side in medieval royal life. The night deepens around our imagined castle, and now we travel northward into Scandinavia and the Baltic world, where the climate was colder, but royal courts were just as intense with politics and suspicion. Here we meet Queen Margaret I of Denmark, a ruler whose life reveals another important truth. Sometimes a woman's effectiveness in leadership alone was enough to create uncomfortable stories around her. Margaret lived during the late 1300s, a time when Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were separate kingdoms often competing with one another. Through inheritance and careful negotiation, she gradually gained influence over all three realms. When her young son died unexpectedly, she did not lose power. Instead, she continued governing as regent and later organized the Kalmar Union, placing the three kingdoms under one crown. From a modern perspective, this appears as political skill and patience. But for many nobles of her time, it was difficult to accept that a woman could maintain such authority without explanation. She attended councils, resolved disputes between nobles, and negotiated treaties with foreign rulers. Chroniclers wrote about her intelligence and determination, yet some also described her influence in suspicious tones, suggesting manipulation rather than administration. These reactions help us understand how medieval society struggled to interpret female authority. A king commanding obedience was ordinary. A queen achieving the same result seemed unusual. Instead of acknowledging political ability directly, some observers attributed success to hidden motives or personal control over those around her. Again, rumor grew not from confirmed acts, but from discomfort with her role. Court ceremonies still followed strict order. Nobles approached her carefully, kneeling and speaking through formal phrases. Letters arrived from distant territories reporting conflicts, taxes, and trade. She reviewed them, consulted advisors, and made decisions affecting thousands of people she would never meet. Her authority depended on careful balance, firm enough to prevent rebellion, but measured enough to maintain loyalty. We also see how travel affected queens. Unlike modern rulers who remain in one capital, medieval monarchs moved frequently between castles. Margaret traveled constantly across her realms to maintain presence. A ruler seen by subjects appeared legitimate. During these journeys, she met local leaders, confirmed laws, and heard complaints. Movement was part of governance. Every journey created new opportunities for speculation. A queen spending extended time in one location might be accused of favoritism toward certain nobles. Friendly conversations could be misinterpreted. Even hospitality shown to a guest could become a story repeated elsewhere. The larger her territory grew, the harder it became to control how news of her actions spread. Religion again influenced perception. Queens were expected to show devotion through charity, church patronage, and moral example. Margaret supported monasteries and maintained relations with church leaders, yet her strong administrative role overshadowed these acts in the minds of critics. Stories focused on power rather than routine piety, because power created drama. Inside her residences, daily life was structured but busy. Servants maintained clothing and kitchens. Scribes recorded decisions. Messengers arrived at all hours with reports from across Scandinavia. Even during meals, discussions about disputes or trade continued. Leadership allowed little quiet time. The wider population rarely saw her directly, yet they heard about her constantly. Traveling merchants and clergy carried news between towns. Each retelling simplified complex policies into personal narratives. Over years, these narratives blended truth and imagination. So in the cold northern air outside the palace, where snow rests quietly against wooden walls, we see again that a queen's reputation often reflected society's expectations more than her actions. Authority combined with visibility created attention, and attention created story. And as we continue walking through Europe's courts, we will enter another kingdom, where succession struggles and court rivalries would again turn ordinary political life into lasting legend, whispered long after the candles burned out. Our quiet walk now carries us into the Italian peninsula, where medieval courts were smaller than the great northern kingdoms but often far more intricate in politics. Italian cities were wealthy from trade, and power moved between noble families, church leaders, and local rulers. In these places, reputation could change quickly, and stories traveled even faster because merchants and envoys arrived daily from distant lands. Here we encounter Queen Joanna of Naples, a ruler of the 1300s whose life became surrounded by some of the most persistent court rumors of the Middle Ages. Joanna inherited her throne at a young age and ruled a kingdom important for Mediterranean trade. Unlike many queens who were consorts beside a ruling king, she governed in her own name. This alone placed her under intense observation, because independent female rulers were still unusual. Her marriage became a central political issue. She wed Andrew of Hungary, a prince whose relatives expected him to share authority. Tension developed between their supporters inside the court. Soon after, Andrew died under mysterious circumstances during a visit to a castle at Aversa. He was found killed in the night, and no clear explanation satisfied everyone. Immediately, suspicion filled the kingdom. Opponents accused Joanna of involvement. Supporters defended her innocence. Chroniclers, writing years later, described the event dramatically, and some blamed her personal relationships rather than the wider conflict between noble factions. In reality, historians still debate what truly happened. Many believe rival groups at court had strong motives, yet the queen herself became the central figure of every retelling because her position made the story easier to personalize. Political consequences followed quickly. Foreign powers used the accusations as reason to intervene in Neapolitan affairs. Armies marched not because of proven guilt, but because scandal weakened authority. Joanna fled temporarily and later regained control with support from allies, ruling for many more years. Despite this, the stories never faded. Writers across Europe repeated the tale, often adding details over time until rumor replaced evidence. Court life around her remained formal. Councils met to discuss taxation and defense. Diplomats negotiated trade agreements with Mediterranean ports. Religious ceremonies marked the calendar. Yet each action she took was judged more closely than that of male rulers. A decision seen as strategic could be interpreted as personal preference. A trusted advisor could be described as a favorite. Over years, repeated suspicion shaped how chroniclers remembered her reign. This pattern reveals an important point. Medieval audiences often preferred dramatic explanation to complicated politics. A kingdom's conflict between noble families, foreign interests, and inheritance law was difficult to summarize. A story centered on the queen's private conduct was easier to understand and remember. Therefore, the simpler story survived longer. Inside her palace, daily routine continued, receiving ambassadors, managing finances, arranging marriages among nobles, and supporting religious foundations. These tasks filled most of her time, yet they rarely appear in popular memory because they lacked the drama chroniclers preferred to record. Servants again observed everything. They prepared clothing, carried letters, and escorted visitors. Even ordinary gestures, a conversation in a hallway or a meeting held after sunset, could be interpreted and repeated. In a court already tense from succession disputes, small observations became large claims. As evening falls over the warm southern city, and the sound of distant sea wind reaches the palace walls, we see how easily a ruler's life could become legend. Whether guilty or innocent mattered less to storytellers than the existence of a compelling narrative. The queen became a symbol onto which political fear and rivalry were projected, and so we continue gently onward through medieval Europe, where another royal household will again show how expectation, power, and rumor combine to create reputations remembered centuries after the real daily lives had quietly passed. From the warm ports of southern Italy, we move slowly westward into the Iberian kingdoms again, where stone fortresses rose above dry hills and royal courts balanced diplomacy with constant rivalry between noble families. Here we meet a queen whose story shows how quickly suspicion could grow even when evidence was uncertain. Blanche of Bourbon, Queen of Castile in the 1300s. Blanche was a young French princess sent to marry King Peter of Castile as part of a political alliance between France and Castile. Like many royal brides, she traveled far from home to a land where language, customs, and people were unfamiliar. Her marriage ceremony was celebrated publicly. Banners hung across the city, and nobles gathered to witness the union that promised peace between kingdoms. Yet almost immediately the situation changed. The king showed little interest in the marriage and returned to the company of Maria of Padilla, the woman who already held his affection. Blanche was left isolated inside the palace, surrounded by attendants but without real influence. She fulfilled formal duties expected of a queen, attending court, appearing at ceremonies, and maintaining dignity, but she lacked political support. Soon strange accusations began to appear. Some claimed she was unlucky. Others whispered she had offended the king through hidden behavior. No clear explanation existed, yet rumor filled the silence. Instead of acknowledging the king's personal preference or court factionalism, observers searched for fault in the queen herself. In medieval thinking, an unsuccessful marriage often required a moral cause. Blanche was eventually confined to different castles under guard, a situation not uncommon for royal figures caught in political disputes. Her imprisonment was presented by some writers as punishment for unknown actions, while others described it as purely political, connected to the king's desire to favor another household. Historians today generally see her as a victim of court conflict rather than wrongdoing, but the medieval stories continued to circulate. The court around her continued daily routine, councils meeting, taxes collected, military preparations discussed. Yet her personal situation became a symbol in broader struggles. Foreign rulers protested her treatment because she was related to their own royal families. Diplomats negotiated over her fate. Still, the public remembered mainly the mystery surrounding her isolation. This example shows how reputation could form even without visible events. Absence itself created suspicion. When a queen disappeared from ceremonies or celebrations, people wondered why. Without clear information, imagination supplied answers. Over time, those imagined explanations hardened into accepted stories. In castles where she stayed, life was quiet but structured. Guards watched gates, servants maintained rooms, and chaplains conducted prayers. She lived surrounded by formality, yet separated from power. Her situation illustrates another aspect of medieval queenship. A queen's security depended entirely on political favor. Without support from the king or major nobles, her title offered little protection. Chroniclers later repeated various claims about her character, many written long after her lifetime by authors who never met her. Their writings reveal more about the expectations of their society than about her real actions. A queen abandoned by her husband became easier to describe as morally flawed than to portray as a casualty of alliance politics. As the sun sets behind the castle walls and shadows lengthen across courtyards, we see again how fragile royal reputation could be. Honor and scandal often grew from circumstances beyond a person's control, shaped by alliances, inheritance, and rivalry rather than personal behavior. And so we continue quietly onward through Europe's courts, where another royal household will show how the mixture of politics, fear, and storytelling kept shaping how queens were remembered long after the actual events had faded into silence. Let us continue walking softly through another court, and now we enter the royal household of late medieval France, where long tapestries covered cold stone walls and tall windows looked out across enclosed gardens. Courts in France were among the most ceremonial in Europe. Every movement of a queen, how she greeted visitors, where she sat during meals, and whom she spoke to, carried meaning far beyond the moment itself. Here we come to Catherine de' Medici, who lived at the very end of the medieval world and the beginning of the early modern age. Although later than some others we have visited, her life still followed the same traditions and expectations formed during the Middle Ages. She arrived from Italy as a young bride to marry the future King Henry II of France. Like many royal marriages, it was arranged to strengthen alliances, not affection. At court, she quickly discovered that her husband favored another woman, Diane de Poitiers, a noble woman older than himself who held strong influence. Catherine therefore lived in a delicate position. She was queen by title, but not always by attention. For many years she quietly observed politics rather than openly directing it. She learned the personalities of nobles, the rivalries between families, and the delicate balance required to maintain peace. When her husband died unexpectedly, everything changed. Her sons were still young, and she became regent, ruling in their name. France at that time faced religious conflict between Catholic and Protestant groups. Catherine negotiated constantly to prevent civil war, arranging marriages, mediating disputes, and traveling between cities to meet leaders. Her days were filled not with leisure but with endless diplomacy, yet because she held influence, rumor again followed. Writers later described her in dramatic ways, claiming hidden manipulation or secret plots. Some accused her of controlling the court through personal persuasion rather than political necessity. These stories grew larger over time, especially after violent events such as the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, when conflict erupted in Paris. Historians debate her exact role, but in popular memory, she became a figure of intrigue because people sought a personal explanation for national crisis. Court routine around her remained formal. Mornings began with mass, councils followed, Ambassadors presented letters sealed with wax. Evenings included banquets where music and conversation masked ongoing negotiation. The Queen had to remain composed before hundreds of watching eyes, speaking carefully to avoid favoring one faction openly. Servants once again witnessed the quiet details. Which advisors were admitted privately, which nobles waited longer for audience, which messages were sent at night. These observations, repeated outside the palace, transformed into stories told across the kingdom. A queen's ordinary political meetings became described as secret influence because observers lacked access to her reasoning. The pressure of producing heirs also shaped reputation. Royal children represented stability. Every pregnancy, birth, or illness became public concern. If succession seemed uncertain, anxiety grew, and blame often turned toward the Queen. Her body itself became part of national politics, watched as closely as any council decision. We begin to see a repeating pattern across Europe. The more responsibility a queen held, the more intense the stories surrounding her. Leadership required conversation, negotiation, and trust with advisors. Observers, unable to see policy discussions directly, explained influence through personal narratives instead. As night settles over the French palace gardens and lanterns glow beside quiet paths, the court appears peaceful from a distance. Yet within its chambers discussions continue. Letters are written, and alliances are formed. The Queen remains awake long after ceremonies end, because governance does not follow the rhythm of celebration. And so we keep moving gently forward through history, understanding more clearly how medieval society created legends around its queens, not always from their actions, but from the tension between expectation and authority. Our quiet journey now carries us back across the English Channel, into England once again, where castles stood above rivers and royal households traveled from residence to residence through the countryside. English courts were never still for long. Kings and queens moved frequently so they could be seen by subjects and nobles, and wherever the court traveled, stories traveled with it. Here we meet Anne Boleyn, one of the most discussed queens in European history. Her story shows perhaps more clearly than any other how political change, religion, and rumor could combine into a reputation far larger than a real person's daily life. Anne did not begin as queen. She grew up partly in France, learning court manners, languages, and diplomacy, before returning to England to serve in the household of Queen Catherine of Aragon. King Henry VIII soon noticed her. At that time, the king already had a wife, but he lacked a male heir. The situation became a political problem, because succession uncertainty could lead to conflict. Henry sought to annul his marriage. The request involved church authority, foreign alliances, and legal arguments lasting years. During this long dispute, Anne remained near the center of attention. Because she was associated with the king's decision, opinion divided sharply. Supporters saw her as the future mother of a stable dynasty. Opponents blamed her for disturbing an existing marriage. Pamphlets and poems began to circulate. Some praised her intelligence and conversation. Others described her with harsh language and accusations meant to discredit her influence. Court life around her was filled with ceremony. She attended banquets, listened to music, and hosted visitors. Yet nearly every appearance was interpreted politically. A smile at one noble could be seen as favor. A conversation with an ambassador could be described as persuasion. Even clothing choices were discussed because fashion symbolized royal identity. After Henry established a new church authority separate from Rome, he married Anne and crowned her queen. Expectations became enormous. The birth of a child would confirm the king's decision. She gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, who would later become a famous ruler. But at that moment, the absence of a son disappointed many who feared future disputes. Soon tension grew within the court. Advisors changed. Rival factions competed for influence. In this atmosphere, accusations appeared. Claims that she behaved improperly and conspired against the king. A trial followed, and she was condemned and executed. Modern historians question the reliability of the charges, seeing them as connected to political necessity rather than clear evidence. Yet at the time, the dramatic narrative spread quickly across Europe. This episode demonstrates how medieval and early modern courts explained political shifts through personal stories. Removing a queen for strategic reasons became easier to present as moral failure. Chroniclers wrote detailed accounts, and readers remembered the story because it contained clear characters and dramatic events. Inside the palace during her final days, routine still continued. Servants carried meals, guards watched doors, and priests offered prayers. Outside, ordinary citizens heard fragments of news repeated in markets and taverns. Each retelling added certainty, even if the original facts were uncertain. As we stand quietly in the fading evening light near the palace walls, we see again how royal reputation depended on perception. A queen could rise to great honor and fall into disgrace within a few seasons, not because daily life changed, but because political needs changed. And so we continued gently onward, moving to another royal household where similar patterns of expectation, power, and storytelling shaped memory long after the real voices of the court had gone silent. Now let us slow down properly and stay longer inside one royal world, so we can truly understand how scandal grew, how rumor moved, and how a queen's reputation could stretch far beyond her actual daily life. Instead of rushing between courts, we remain in England for a while and look closely at the long shadow left by royal accusation and public memory. After Anne Boleyn's execution, the English court did not suddenly become quiet or stable. Instead, something deeper had changed. The removal of a crowned queen through public trial created a new kind of fear within palace walls. Everyone understood that royal favor could shift quickly. If a queen could fall, anyone could fall. This atmosphere shaped the behavior of the women who followed her. Among them was Catherine Howard, another queen of Henry VIII. She arrived at court young, raised in a noble but not especially powerful family. Like many girls of her time, she had grown up in a large household where supervision was not always strict. Later, enemies would use stories from her youth as evidence against her, but at the time such informal behavior was not unusual in aristocratic homes. When Henry married Catherine, he was older and ill. The marriage initially brought celebration. Court festivals were held, music echoed in great halls, and foreign ambassadors wrote letters describing the Queen's beauty and charm. Yet beneath the surface, rival families watched closely. In a court already shaped by suspicion after Anne Boleyn's fall, small whispers could grow quickly. Eventually, accusations appeared that Catherine had maintained inappropriate relationships both before and after her marriage. Investigations followed. Servants were questioned. Letters were examined. The court again witnessed a queen placed under arrest within the same palace corridors where she had recently hosted banquets. Historians continue to debate the fairness of these charges. What remains clear is how swiftly the narrative formed. Chroniclers described her in moral language rather than political terms. Instead of discussing factional rivalry or power struggles between noble families, writers focused on personal conduct. The explanation was simpler, and therefore it spread faster. Inside the palace during her confinement, daily life continued as always. Kitchens prepared food, guards rotated shifts, councils met about taxes and foreign affairs. Yet in private chambers, tension filled the air. Courtiers avoided speaking too freely. Servants lowered their voices. Every word felt dangerous. The pattern repeats again. When power shifted, storytelling filled the space. Political convenience often dressed itself in moral accusation. Removing a queen through claims of misconduct provided a public justification easier to understand than complex diplomacy or court rivalry. Beyond England, similar dynamics unfolded. In Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, queens faced constant evaluation. A royal marriage might secure peace between kingdoms, but it also brought cultural difference. A foreign-born queen could be viewed with suspicion. If economic hardship struck or military campaigns failed, blame might fall upon the foreign influence she symbolized. Consider how succession anxiety intensified everything. A kingdom without a clear heir risked civil war. Every royal pregnancy became a national event. Courtiers calculated political futures based on unborn children. In such conditions, any rumor regarding a queen's loyalty or conduct felt threatening to stability itself. The more important her role, the more fragile her reputation. We must also remember the role of literature and art. Medieval writers often composed moral tales about powerful women to warn readers against ambition or desire. These stories shaped public imagination long after real events ended. A queen involved in political negotiation could later be portrayed as manipulative. A queen who acted decisively during crisis could be described as dangerous. Over generations, these literary images merged with historical memory. If we pause now inside a quiet royal chapel at night, the candles flicker against stone pillars. The throne stands empty for the moment. In this stillness, we understand that behind every dramatic story lay years of routine, prayer, administration, childbirth, charity, negotiation. Most days were ordinary, yet history remembered only the extraordinary. The phrase "most perverted," often attached to these queens in later centuries, says more about those retelling the stories than about the queens themselves. Medieval courts valued order, lineage, and visible stability. When events disrupted that order, society searched for personal explanations. The queen, positioned between private chamber and public throne, became the most visible figure through whom anxiety could be expressed. And so as we remain within these long corridors, we see that scandal was rarely simple. It grew from political rivalry, cultural expectation, religious authority, and the human tendency to turn complex events into dramatic narrative. The queens themselves lived structured ceremonial lives under constant observation, balancing duty and survival in environments where a single rumor could alter history. We will continue from here, staying within this world of royal households and careful whispers, moving even deeper into how medieval society created legends around its queens, and why those legends lasted so long after the candles finally burned out. Let us remain inside these echoing corridors a little longer and look more deeply at how the machinery of rumor truly worked. Because without understanding that machinery, the reputations of medieval queens can seem louder and darker than the world they actually lived in. A royal court was not simply a palace, it was a moving city made of hierarchy. At the center stood the king and queen. Around them stood nobles competing for influence. Around them again stood servants, guards, clerics, musicians, physicians, cooks, tailors, scribes, and messengers. Every layer observed the one above it. Information flowed upward and downward constantly, and nothing remained contained for long. A queen's chamber was not the private refuge we imagine today. Ladies-in-waiting shared space with her. Senior attendants helped her dress, assisted with correspondence, and remained nearby during meals or prayer. Doors were guarded, but not sealed from knowledge. When she received a visitor, even if conversation occurred behind curtains, someone escorted that visitor inside and outside. Someone noted the hour. Someone noticed how long the meeting lasted. It did not require wrongdoing for speculation to begin. It required only observation without explanation. In medieval thought, power that was not fully visible invited suspicion. Kings ruled openly through command and battle. Queens influenced through conversation, persuasion, and alliance. When outcomes changed after private meetings, observers connected the two events even if no improper act existed. A treaty signed the day after a late discussion became proof of hidden influence. A noble promoted after extended access to the queen became evidence of favoritism. Over time, these patterns formed narratives repeated across years. We must also consider the deep religious structure of medieval life. The church did not separate morality from governance. A ruler's virtue was believed to affect divine favor upon the kingdom. Drought, plague, or defeat in war could be interpreted as punishment for hidden sin within leadership. Because queens symbolized fertility and continuity, their moral image held symbolic weight. If the realm struggled, critics sometimes searched for fault within the royal household, and rumor provided convenient answers. There were also political advantages in shaping scandal. A faction seeking to weaken a rival family might circulate whispers that the queen preferred another advisor. If enough people believed she trusted a certain noble, that noble's enemies gained reason to challenge him. In this way, rumor became a political tool rather than mere gossip. It functioned quietly but effectively, shifting loyalties without open confrontation. Consider the rhythm of a royal day. The queen rose early, attended mass, met with advisors, supervised household accounts, arranged marriages for attendants, and received ambassadors. Much of this work involved discussion and negotiation. Yet chroniclers rarely described hours spent reviewing documents or organizing charitable donations. Instead, they focused on moments that could be dramatized. Human memory prefers intensity to routine. Over decades, repetition transformed exaggeration into accepted truth. Later writers who had never witnessed the events relied on earlier chronicles. If an earlier text hinted at impropriety, a later one might state it more firmly. By the time centuries passed, the original uncertainty disappeared. What began as suspicion solidified into legend. Even architecture contributed to misunderstanding. Medieval castles contained hidden passages, private stairways, and separated wings. These features were practical, designed for security and convenience. But later, imagination saw them as secretive. A queen moving through a side corridor to avoid public halls could later be described as acting mysteriously. The building itself invited storytelling. We should also reflect on how gender expectations shaped interpretation. Medieval society expected queens to be modest, loyal, and maternally focused. If a queen displayed strong political skill or independent judgment, it unsettled those expectations. Instead of describing her as strategic, some chroniclers labeled her manipulative. Instead of acknowledging diplomatic intelligence, they hinted at personal influence. The language used reveals more about cultural discomfort than about confirmed behavior. And yet, inside these same palaces, life contained long stretches of normalcy. Queens sponsored monasteries, funded hospitals, and corresponded with family members abroad. They arranged the education of children, oversaw textile workshops, and participated in seasonal festivals. These acts rarely generated dramatic narrative, but they formed the majority of their lived experience. If we stand now beside a tall window overlooking a quiet courtyard, we can imagine the stillness after a banquet ends. Servants clear wooden tables, torches dim. The queen withdraws to her chamber, not to scheme, but to rest before another day of obligation. Outside, however, someone retells a story about who spoke to whom and how long they stood together. By morning, that retelling may sound different. Thus, the idea of perversion attached to certain queens across history often emerged from this environment of observation, expectation, and political rivalry. Real human lives were layered with duty and constraint, yet later memory distilled them into dramatic portraits because drama survives longer than detail. We remain within this world, aware now that behind every scandal lay structure, hierarchy, religion, succession anxiety, and the simple human tendency to explain power through story. And as we continue forward, we will look at how these layered forces shaped not only individual reputations, but the entire way medieval queenship has been remembered through time. Now that we understand how rumor formed, we can look more calmly at how a queen actually lived day to day, because the ordinary rhythm of her life explains why misunderstandings were almost unavoidable. A medieval queen did not spend most of her time in dramatic intrigue. Instead, she lived inside a routine filled with obligation, repetition, and careful behavior from morning until night. The day often began before sunrise. Bells from the castle chapel marked early prayer, and the queen, along with her attendants, attended Mass. Religion structured time in the Middle Ages. Prayers were not occasional, they were expected daily. Afterward, she would dress with the help of ladies-in-waiting, clothing chosen not only for comfort but to represent royal dignity. Fabric, color, and jewelry communicated authority to everyone who saw her. Following this came audiences. Petitioners waited in long halls hoping to present requests, land disputes, financial appeals, or pleas for protection. While the king dealt with military or legal matters, the queen often listened to cases involving households, widows, and local concerns. She acted as a mediator. Many subjects believed approaching the queen was safer than approaching powerful male officials, and therefore she became a bridge between the crown and ordinary people. Midday meals were public events. Nobles gathered at long tables. Seating position revealed rank. Conversation had to remain polite and measured because every word might later be repeated elsewhere. The queen learned to speak carefully, never favoring one noble openly above another. Even laughter required restraint. Too much warmth toward a particular person might be remembered and retold. Afternoons involved administration. Queens managed extensive estates that funded their households. They reviewed accounts, approved repairs, and supervised servants numbering in the hundreds. Workshops produced clothing and tapestries. Food stores had to be monitored to support large traveling courts. These responsibilities required organization and patience rather than secrecy. Evenings brought ceremony or entertainment. Musicians played, poets recited, and guests visited. The queen hosted foreign envoys whose impressions would travel back to distant rulers. Every gesture carried diplomatic meaning. A simple walk in the garden beside a visiting noble might later be interpreted as alliance or favoritism. Again, the ordinary action gained exaggerated importance. Privacy was extremely limited. Attendants slept nearby for security and service. Doors remained guarded but rarely empty. Letters she wrote were carried by messengers who could be questioned along the road. Unlike modern figures, she could not step away unnoticed. Observation was constant. Pregnancy added another layer. The birth of an heir determined political stability. When a queen expected a child, physicians, clergy, and nobles all watched carefully. Celebrations were planned in advance. If a son was born, the kingdom felt secure. If a daughter arrived, relief mixed with uncertainty. This pressure affected how people interpreted her behavior. Any suggestion of impropriety threatened not only her reputation, but the perceived legitimacy of the future ruler. Because of these expectations, even kindness could create misunderstanding. A queen comforting a loyal supporter after loss might be described later as favoritism. A long conversation about politics might be repeated as personal attachment. The court environment amplified small details into meaningful signs. Chroniclers writing later often simplified complex years into brief moral lessons. Instead of describing countless days of management and diplomacy, they selected dramatic moments. Readers preferred clear stories, a virtuous queen, or a corrupt one. The quiet reality in between rarely survived in writing. If we pause inside a dim corridor now, the palace appears peaceful. A servant carries a candle. A guard stands near a doorway. Somewhere a child laughs softly. None of this feels scandalous, yet this is where most of a queen's life occurred. She existed in ceremony and responsibility far more than in secret action. Understanding this rhythm changes how we see those reputations. The constant observation, the political tension, and the importance of succession meant that any rumor found fertile ground. Stories about misconduct often reflected the environment's pressure rather than proven events. And as the castle settles into late evening and footsteps fade, we continue our journey, seeing how memory preserved the loudest stories while the quieter daily realities remained hidden behind stone walls and flickering torchlight. We now move gently beyond the palace walls themselves and listen to the wider world outside the court, because a queen's reputation was not created only inside castles. It lived among townspeople, travelers, monks, and merchants who never saw her directly yet spoke about her as if they knew her personally. Medieval Europe did not have newspapers, but it had something just as powerful: storytelling carried by voice. News traveled along roads. Pilgrims walked between shrines. Traders moved from market to market. Soldiers returned from campaigns. Clergy journeyed between monasteries. Each group carried information gathered from the last place they visited. When they reached a new town, they repeated what they had heard. Over time, these retellings became more confident and more detailed, even when the original source had been uncertain. Monasteries played a particularly important role. Monks wrote chronicles to record events year by year. Their intention was to preserve memory and offer moral lessons. When they described rulers, they often explained political change through personal virtue or sin. If a king lost a battle, they searched for a moral cause. If a kingdom prospered, they credited righteousness. Therefore, stories about queens sometimes became symbolic, not merely about a person, but about what writers believed society should learn. A queen rumored to behave improperly could be presented as a warning about disorder. A queen praised for devotion could represent stability. These written accounts were copied again and again by later scribes. Each copy carried the same interpretation forward. Centuries later, historians would still read these texts and see the strong opinions embedded within them. The church also influenced expectations strongly. Queens were expected to show public piety. They funded monasteries, sponsored relics, and attended religious ceremonies. If they were visible in these activities, they gained respect. If they appeared distant or preoccupied with politics, critics found opportunity to question their virtue. Sometimes the difference between praise and suspicion depended simply on which actions observers chose to emphasize. We must also remember literacy was limited. Most people did not read official documents themselves. They relied on spoken explanation from priests or travelers. Spoken words change easily with each telling. A careful description becomes a simpler story. A complicated political dispute becomes a personal conflict. Over time, memory favors what is easiest to understand. Markets were centers of such exchange. Merchants unpacked goods while discussing events in distant capitals. Customers listened and repeated the tales later in taverns or homes. The queen became a figure people discussed daily despite never meeting her. Her life transformed into shared narrative shaped by imagination as much as fact. Royal ceremonies reinforced this connection. When a queen appeared in procession, wearing embroidered garments and riding beneath banners, the public saw only a brief image. Yet that image lingered. People filled the unknown details afterward with speculation. A smile might be remembered as kindness. A serious expression might be described as pride. These impressions spread quickly because visual memory was powerful. Foreign ambassadors contributed as well. They wrote letters describing courts to their own rulers. These reports were sometimes cautious, sometimes exaggerated to impress readers. When copied and circulated, they influenced how other kingdoms perceived a queen's character. International reputation could therefore grow from interpretation rather than direct knowledge. Over decades, these spoken and written traditions layered upon one another. The original events became distant, while the story became clearer and more dramatic. A queen remembered for political negotiation might later be remembered only for rumor. Each generation simplified the narrative until it fit familiar patterns of virtue or scandal. If we imagine now a quiet village far from any palace, evening falls and families gather beside a hearth. A traveler shares news from a distant court. Children listen wide-eyed. Adults nod thoughtfully. None of them were present, yet the story becomes part of their understanding of the world. In this way, reputation travels farther than any messenger. Thus, the legends surrounding medieval queens were not created by a single person or moment. They were shaped slowly by thousands of conversations, copied manuscripts, and retellings across generations. What began as uncertainty hardened into memory, and as night spreads across fields and roads leading toward the next town, we continue gently onward, seeing how history preserved not only events, but the way people chose to explain those events long after the real voices of the court had fallen silent. We now return quietly from the villages and roads back toward the palace itself, but this time we look not at gossip or rumor, rather at the deeper reason these stories lasted so long. The memory of medieval queens did not survive only because people enjoyed dramatic tales. It survived because a queen stood at the center of something extremely fragile: succession. In the Middle Ages, the stability of a kingdom depended almost entirely on a clear line of inheritance. There were no modern elections, no written constitutions followed by every citizen. Authority passed through bloodlines. A single child could decide peace or war for an entire generation. Because of this, the queen's role as mother became political as much as personal. When a queen married, the entire kingdom watched for signs of pregnancy. Celebrations followed every announcement. Prayers were held in churches across cities. Nobles calculated their future loyalties based on the expected child. If a healthy son was born, relief spread across the realm. It meant continuity. Landowners kept their titles. Laws remained stable. Armies avoided civil conflict. But if uncertainty appeared, tension grew quickly. A child who died young, a birth delayed, or rumors questioning legitimacy could cause factions to form. Nobles might support different claimants to the throne. Even before conflict began, fear spread. In such a situation, any suggestion about the queen's personal conduct carried enormous consequences. It was no longer private gossip. It became a question about the future ruler. This explains why accusations against queens often appeared during succession crises. Rival families gained advantage by casting doubt on the heir's legitimacy. They did not need to prove wrongdoing. They only needed enough suspicion that others hesitated. A whispered question, "Is the child truly the king's?" could be more powerful than an army because it divided loyalty. The queen therefore lived under a form of observation that few people today could imagine. Her friendships, conversations, and even moments of kindness were examined for meaning. If she trusted a particular advisor, critics might suggest hidden closeness. If she spent time writing letters to relatives abroad, some wondered whether foreign influence shaped decisions. Each action connected in people's minds to the question of inheritance. We also notice how medical knowledge of the time increased uncertainty. Physicians understood far less about fertility and illness than today. Miscarriages were common, but rarely explained. Infant mortality was high. Without scientific explanation, people searched for moral or personal causes. Blame easily fell upon visible figures within the royal household. Even the timing of a birth could spark stories. If a child arrived earlier or later than expected, speculation began. Chroniclers recorded such details carefully because they affected political interpretation. Over years, these small observations transformed into strong claims repeated by later writers who never witnessed the event. Inside the palace, however, daily life remained structured. The queen attended religious services, supervised education of her children, and prepared them for public appearances. Tutors taught languages and manners. The royal nursery was guarded closely, not only for safety but to reassure nobles that the heir existed and was healthy. Visitors sometimes viewed the child precisely to confirm legitimacy. This constant pressure meant that a queen's identity became larger than her personality. She was not seen simply as an individual woman, but as the living guarantee of order. When stability seemed threatened, society looked toward her first, because her role connected directly to the future of the kingdom. As night settles once more across the palace and torches glow along the walls, we realize the legends surrounding these queens were rooted in anxiety about continuity. People feared chaos, they feared civil war, and in that fear, they explained uncertainty through personal stories about the most visible figure near the throne. So we continue gently forward, understanding more clearly now that what later generations called scandal often began as concern for stability, growing gradually into legend as years passed and memory reshaped reality. Now we take one more slow look at the royal household itself, not through the eyes of nobles or chroniclers, but through the people who lived closest to the queen every day, her attendants. These women, called ladies-in-waiting, were not servants in the simple sense. Most were daughters of noble families. Their parents sent them to court to learn manners, form alliances, and gain favor with the crown. They dressed the queen, accompanied her in public, and remained near her chambers. Because of this, they stood closer to her daily life than anyone else. Their presence created both support and danger. A queen depended on them for companionship and trust in a world where few relationships were safe. She spoke with them freely, shared worries, and relied on their help managing letters and visitors. Yet each attendant also belonged to a family with its own political interests. Even without bad intention, a detail mentioned casually could travel outward once a letter reached home. A simple description: who visited, how long a meeting lasted, whether the queen seemed pleased or worried, might be repeated in another court hundreds of miles away. Over time, this constant flow of information shaped public understanding of the queen's personality. A comment spoken privately might become a widely known opinion. A friendship could be described as influence. The attendants themselves rarely planned scandal, but their closeness meant they unintentionally carried the small observations from which stories grew. Marriage negotiations often began here as well. Foreign ambassadors approached ladies-in-waiting before approaching the queen directly, hoping they might speak favorably on behalf of a proposal. Gifts passed quietly: fine fabric, jewelry, or letters, all ordinary parts of diplomacy. Yet later chroniclers sometimes interpreted such exchanges as secretive behavior rather than normal court practice. We should also remember how young many queens were. Some married in their early teens. They entered a foreign land surrounded by strangers and relied heavily on the few familiar faces around them. Emotional closeness to attendants provided comfort in an unfamiliar world. Later writers, viewing events from afar, sometimes misunderstood this natural dependence and described it in exaggerated terms. Daily life inside the women's quarters was structured but gentle. Mornings included prayer and sewing. Afternoons might involve music, reading, or walking in enclosed gardens. Children played nearby under supervision. Conversation filled long hours while nobles attended councils elsewhere. Much of this life was quiet and ordinary, yet it existed beside the grand political decisions of the kingdom. At night, when the outer court grew silent, the queen often remained awake longer than others. Letters needed answering. Family abroad expected news. She wrote carefully, knowing any message could be opened on the road. Even affectionate phrases were chosen with caution, because written words lasted longer than spoken ones. Because attendants were always nearby, true solitude was rare. Even sleep occurred within shared chambers. This constant presence meant every mood change was noticed. If the queen appeared tired, someone commented. If she seemed worried, questions followed. Such small observations accumulated until they formed an image repeated beyond the palace. In this way, reputation developed from ordinary human closeness. The more visible a person became, the less private interpretation remained. Over years, later generations remembered only the dramatic conclusions, forgetting the countless quiet days that produced them. As evening settles over the gardens and soft voices fade behind heavy doors, we understand that medieval queens lived not in secrecy, but in continuous company. Their lives were open to observation almost every hour. From that observation came explanation, and from explanation came legend. We move gently onward, keeping this awareness with us as we approach the final reflections on why these stories endured so strongly, long after the real women themselves had passed into history. Now we come to the final stretch of our long walk through these echoing medieval corridors, and instead of focusing on one single queen, we pause to gather everything we have seen. The castles, the tapestries, the guarded doors, the quiet chapels, the councils that lasted for hours, the births celebrated with bells, the whispers passed from attendant to merchant. All of it forms a pattern much larger than any one dramatic accusation. When later generations use strong words to describe certain queens, they are often repeating stories shaped by fear, politics, and expectation, rather than confirmed behavior. Medieval society required stability above all else. The throne represented order. The heir represented the future. The queen stood at the center of both. Because of that, her body, her friendships, her speech, and even her silence carried political meaning. If the kingdom prospered, she was praised as virtuous. If the kingdom struggled, she became a convenient explanation. Chroniclers, writing with moral purpose, shaped narratives that fit their understanding of divine order. Rival nobles used rumor to weaken opponents. Foreign ambassadors exaggerated details to impress their own rulers. Over time, repeated description replaced uncertainty with certainty. Yet inside the palace walls, daily life was rarely dramatic. Queens woke early for prayer. They supervised servants, managed estates, arranged marriages, wrote letters, and cared for children. They endured loneliness in foreign lands and learned to speak carefully in rooms full of listeners. Most days passed without scandal. Most hours were filled with routine. The distance between lived reality and remembered legend grew slowly. A small suspicion written into a chronicle became a firm accusation centuries later. A political removal became a moral story. A diplomatic alliance became a tale of manipulation. History preserved what was striking, not what was ordinary. As we stand quietly now in a dimly lit hall, imagine the candles nearly burned down, the echo of footsteps fading, and the throne empty for the night. The women whose names survived were once living individuals, navigating expectations that left little space for personal freedom. They carried crowns heavy not only with gold, but with the constant weight of observation. In truth, the legends surrounding them reveal as much about medieval society as about the queens themselves. They show a world anxious about succession, deeply religious in interpretation, and eager to explain political change through personal narrative. The stories endured because they were simple, memorable, and dramatic. The quiet reality was more complex and far more human. And so our journey closes gently here. The torches dim. The corridors grow still. Beyond the palace walls, ordinary people continue their lives, repeating stories that will travel far beyond their own lifetimes. If you enjoyed this slow walk through medieval courts and the stories that shaped royal memory, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and share which world of history we should step into next for another long, deep journey together. Until next time, when we open another ancient door and let the past speak softly once more.